Good morning, students. In continuation with the topic budget expenditure, where I have explained you revenue expenditure and capital expenditure. So today in this session, I am going to explain you that how budget expenditure is also classified as planned expenditure and non-planned expenditure. Now children, let's see what is a planned expenditure. When we talk about planned expenditure, it refers to that expenditure which relates to first, a specified plans and programs of development. Second, assistance of the central government to the state government. It includes both revenue expenditure and capital expenditure, like expenditure on construction of roads, bridges, hospitals, and so on. That means a planned expenditure is that expenditure which is pre-planned, related to certain plans and programs for the development of the country. Now, if we talk about non-planned expenditure, then non-planned expenditure is that expenditure which is being, let's say, which is related to expenditure on routine functioning of the government. Means as the work comes and accordingly the expenditure is being done. This is the expenditure for the routine work. It can also include expenditure on services as of law and order, defense and subsidies. So children, you can also say that budget expenditure equals to revenue expenditure plus capital expenditure, or budget expenditure equals to plan expenditure and non-plan expenditure. That means budget expenditure could be explained in both ways, as a revenue expenditure and capital expenditure, or a planned expenditure and non-planned expenditure. Now children, this concept of budget, government budget, we can also say it has two broad components, as you know very well, that is revenue budget and capital budget. Now if we take one by one and let's talk about revenue budget. So children, revenue budget or revenue account includes all such items of the government which relates to revenue receipts and revenue expenditure of the government. Now here you have to be very careful, because here we are talking that revenue budget. If it's revenue budget, so remember under this revenue receipts and revenue expenditure will come. Now these revenue budget, they include all such items of receipts and expenditure of the government which do not impact assets liability status of the government. That means revenue budget includes those receipts and expenditure of the government which do not impact the assets and liability status of the government. Now, when revenue budget of the government is in bad shape, when it is in bad shape, let's say when revenue expenditure is greater than revenue receipts, that means what the government receives in the form of a revenue, that is, let's say, in comparison to the expenditure is less, where government expenditure is more than the revenue which the government collects. Now in such condition, the budget of the government comes in a very bad shape. Now to cope up with this situation, the government resorts to borrowing and disinvestment. So to come out from this situation, now what the government do? Either they have to borrow because the expenditure is more, or either they do the disinvestment. Remember disinvestment when we said that, let's say, the rights of the public sector companies are being transferred to the private sector, so the assets are reduced. Now when this happens, then the liability of the government rises and assets of the government are reduced. Because when you do the borrowing, you increase your liabilities, and when you do the disinvestment, you decrease the assets. So when this happens, a rise in liability raises the burden on the future generation, because if the budget of this year increases where expenditure is more than the revenue receipts, then the repayment of loan has to be done in the coming year. So it becomes a burden on the future generation. And fall in assets on the other side lowers the role of public sector enterprise in the process of growth and development. That means if government reduces its assets to cope up with the situation, then government is less with very less of amount of the money which could be used for the growth or development of the country. So children, over here privatization always leads to a high profit but loss of social welfare, because privatization never is ever interested in welfare. Their motive is profit. So there is a loss of welfare. Whereas when we talk about a capital budget or capital account includes all such items of the government which relate to capital receipts and capital expenditure of the government. Now over here, this capital budget, it includes receipts, capital receipt and capital expenditure, and this budget includes only such items of receipts and expenditure of the government which do not impact assets liability status of the government. That means over here the capital receipt and expenditure includes such items which do not impact assets and liability status of the government. Over here the capital budget focuses on the GDP growth. And how do they focus on GDP growth? By way of doing public investment. And you know, high capital receipts are often related to compulsion of borrowing. So it is a sign of backward economy. So children, that is the difference between a revenue budget and a capital budget, and that is how the two are different from each other.